The Kurdish people have suffered violence and oppression for centuries. Their very existence has been denied at times, while their language, dress, and folklore continue to be banned by the nations the Kurds inhabit. The persecution of the Kurds has gone on far too long, and it is time that justice was achieved. It is because we believe that the rights of all ethnic groups should be protected that we so strongly stand in proposition of today's motion. This House supports the creation of an independent Kurdistan. In this speech, a few things. First, I'll be getting into some framework with our definitions, model, and clarifications, and then I'll be getting into the first two substantives on the proposition's case. My partner Ashley will be giving the third. So first, in our definitions, we define an independent Kurdistan as creating an independent nation state for the Kurdish people out of the combined territories of from Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. In our model, we would like to define what it means to be a country as we see it as getting a spot in the UN as a recognized state. Being a sovereign state as a political entity is represented by one central government and has sovereignty over a geographical area. And this is a defined territory, they're one government, the capacity to enter into relations with other countries, and we'd also like in our model to include including military aid from the West as allies against ISIS and Iran, allying with the Kurds. We see this as giving a huge army to the Kurdish people, and this will secure their security in the region when we are able to have them defend themselves in the region. We also think it is principally justified to help Kurdistan because of the principle of reparations that the West owes to Kurdistan. For example, with Israel being made a state, and they were backed militarily by the West as well. And we would also have the West pressure Turkey and the other countries that the Kurds inhabit to create and give the Kurds their own country. And we are establishing a state which creates a set line in the sand that other nations cannot cross without violating the sovereignty of the Kurds. We think this is extremely important in today's debate. And we'd also, on to clarifications, since the early 20th century, the region has been divided between Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, and all of which have brutally repressed their Kurdish minority. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without their own nation, and they have been the ethnic group in their territory for millennia. So we think in our burdens, the burden of the proposition is to prove that creating an independent Kurdistan is both principally justified and practically beneficial to the Kurds specifically. The burden of the opposition is to prove the opposite. And overall, in this debate, our stance is that the status quo is bad for the Kurdish people, but we believe that it only gets exponentially worse unless we take action for the creation of a Kurdish state. So on to the first substantive on the principle of necessity to create an independent Kurdistan. We have three ideas here. The first is on why borders are good, and why are they important, and when are they needed. We think that we need borders when one area is being messed with by the other states. If the border, for example, if the border between the Netherlands and Belgium were to disappear, we wouldn't really care. But on the other hand, if the border were to disappear between North and South Korea, we would care. This is just like with Kurdistan. When we see the conflicts happening currently in their region, we need the border to be set to help the Kurds have their area and have a specific place that they can be in. And if anyone were to encroach across that line, this would be violating their sovereignty, and the other countries cannot cross this line. This brings me into our second point on sovereignty. The argument of principal necessity to have control over one's life and their autonomy. Every ethnic group has its own distinct culture that sets them apart from others, such as Kurdistan is different from Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, and this unifies a group of individuals creating their community. But most importantly, culture is part of the people's identity and how people carry themselves and the values that they uphold. But most importantly, in theory, it might not seem like a problem. However, a lack of a set place for an ethnic group to live in and establish themselves in their culture can be detrimental. This is because of the dominant ethnic group undermines the smaller ethnic group within that state and forces them to assimilate to another culture simply to fit in with society. But I'll give them a chance.
What side proposition tells you as a principal argument is actually incredibly practical. They're saying that we have to have borders because they are effective, which means they're also going to have to show you throughout this debate that borders can actually preserve Kurdish culture. No principle, purely practical.
We think that there is principle when we say that the West has a principle of an obligation to help the Kurds out. But we also think that the borders are practically beneficial when they set the line in the sand that gives the Kurds their place to live. We don't think that the opposition can guarantee that security, and that is one of the biggest points on proposition when we were able to give that border, and that's what specifies making the state so necessary. And so Back again to sovereignty, this is much like the reasoning behind creating Israel, as we said before, which gave a marginalized ethnicity finally a place to call home and a place where their voice was heard. And so on to our third point on our first substantive on reparations. The United States government abandoned Kurdistan, which led to the Kurds being subject to violence from Turkey and other countries in the region. The principal obligation is to provide reparations justifies the principal necessity of the United States and other Western powers backing the Kurds. Since the late 1800s, the United States has implicitly and explicitly exploited the Kurdish people for their own gain, but the U.S. is losing its credibility as a military power and ability to make military deals because the U.S. needed this as much as the Kurds do. The rise in Turkey's violence on the Kurds has proven how necessary the U.S. support was to aid the Kurds, and this also proves why the borders are so necessary. We can see that the U.S. has done harmful things in the past, but the proposition is in an attempt to reverse the bad actions on the part of the United States by securing the Kurdish freedom and by securing their security. We also think it is fundamentally hypocritical for one state to enjoy certain privileges while simultaneously turning around and refusing to grant others that same opportunity, which is what's happening on the opposition side of the House when all these other ethnic groups have their own nation, but we're telling the Kurds that they cannot have theirs. We think that this is similar to when Eritrea became independent from Ethiopia because of the different values that the two countries had, or when Serbia broke off from Montenegro because of the difference in policies and their economies. And so now on to the second substantive. We have two layers here, but before that, to clarify, the reason why there is not an independent Kurdistan in the status quo is because of the pursuit of self-interest, ethnocentrism, and racism. It is not because the Kurds cannot or should not have a state. And so this brings me into our first layer on this substantive on providing political representation. Turkey has perpetuated genocides against the Kurdish people while also banning the political party that represents the Kurds. Syria has stripped the Kurds of their citizenship. Iran has deliberately refused housing and employment to the Kurds, and this needs to change. Even further, there's no way for the Kurds to hold these countries accountable because in the opposition's world, the Kurds have no political identity and no political influence. Their political identity is denied because stateless actors have no influence without an independent state on an international level. We also think that the Kurds' political influence is diluted by being separated into 4 different countries. As Kurdistan, however, the Kurds would have the voice of around 28 million people. The fact that 28 million people are broken up among these 4 states is really problematic because they are now more subject to the violence when they are such a smaller minority. And how does the prop change this? By supporting the creation of an independent Kurdistan, the proposition uniquely provides justice to the Kurds. With the independent country, they're able to actually voice their opinion and create legislation that they support. Our second layer here is creating economic benefits for the Kurds, and autonomous Kurdistan creates more stability and prosperity in Kurdistan and the neighboring nations. The economic stability right now, Iraqi Kurdistan's vast oil reserves are already distributed to the global market, primarily through Turkey, although an independent Kurdistan can only be in a better position to strike similar deals to intensify the flow of gas, water, oil, and diversify energy sources and enhance their economic security. Second, the economic leverage can use Kurdistan's natural resources like oil, gas, and water to create their own economic stability, and this gives Kurds the economic leverage to gain allies, which makes it harder for other countries to try and harm them when they have allies around the world for their resources. Side opposition in their next speech is likely to weigh this against other forms of instability, but we think that all of our case, everything in our case with the borders and the security and providing this economic leverage will outweigh that, and that is why we are so proud to propose today's motion.
The remarks now invite the first opposition to open up debate at the opposition bench.
Side proposition makes 2 critical errors in how they express their case. First, they assume that Kurdistan will be truly independent. And second, they assume that the creation of an independent Kurdistan will increase stability. Because we believe that independent Kurdistan will not increase stability in the area, we strongly oppose the motion. First, a roadmap for today's round. I'll be going on to some key framing, then I'll address the proposition's substantive arguments before moving on to our 2 substantive arguments. First, our stance. Side opposition believes that the motion in the real world would violate critical principles of conduct in global affairs, further destabilize the Middle East, and worsen the lives of the Kurdish people. The burden. It is the burden of both sides to do more than demand perfection from the other side. Trade-offs exist in difficult decision-making and foreign policy. Each side must warrant what the world looks like and engage in a comparative debate where the good is not made the enemy of the perfect. Now on to some arguments on my opponent's case. First, their first their substantive one. No, thank you. The crux of their argument rests on a few claims. First, however, in order to win their principle, they have to show that Kurdistan will be completely independent. The West will be in charge of their military, have leverage over their economy and foreign policy, but you disagree.
This principled argument is not based off of the practical. We're just saying, regardless of any practical arguments, actors like the United States have an obligation to step in order to ensure this idea about self-determination and sovereignty are upheld.
Two key responses to this. First, the West will not give them what they need. Instead, they will be key to their stability in the first place, making Kurdistan not completely independent. And second, I was just getting on their borders argument, which was very practical and a principled argument. Now onto their borders argument. First of all, this is practical, as I just stated, and they also have to prove that borders will be effective in protecting Kurdish sovereignty. We shouldn't do things just because it's the right thing when it comes to the expense of millions of people. Onto their reparations argument, two issues with this. First, this was 45 seconds of very loose analysis on this argument, and second, they don't explain what these reparations look like. Side proposition needs to clarify this for you throughout the debate. No, thank you. On their second substantive argument, they assume that representation will happen, but they won't have self-determinism as they will be dependent on the West, as I've already proved. And second, they claimed that economic gains will occur, but they won't have trading partners in their region. No, thank you. Blockades, sanctions, and tariffs. Independent Kurdistan will be more destabilized and they will have to rely on the West. Proposition is not advocating for a truly independent Kurdistan, nor will they have the stability to sustain themselves. Now on to our substantive arguments. No, thank you. Our first substantive, prioritization of the Kurds is rooted in a traditional mindset of American supremacy. In order to understand this rather complex yet perhaps intuitive principle, a few points of context must be articulated. We have to understand the motion in the context of historical geopolitics, particularly in the relationship between the West and the Kurds, as I've already elaborated on. During the Persian Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush encouraged various ethnic minorities to rise up against the Iraqi and Syrian governments.
On that,
this weakened the legitimacy of the regimes and brought the Kurds to the international stage for the first time since the end of World War I. After the U.S. intervened against the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, no thank you, it left a power vacuum in northern Iraq and the Kurds were equipped to fill. The Kurds adopted Western neoliberal values and made appeals at the West for weapons, aid, and training. This began what appeared to be a mutually beneficial alliance. The Kurds received the support of an international coalition that was critical in combating the Islamic State and could have led to independence. The West invested in what they thought could be a potential ally in an unfriendly region. Given the undeniable history and evident partnerships that exist even today, it is unreasonable to conclude that we can establish and preserve an independent Kurdistan without unwavering military, political, and economic support of the West. The mind-boggling fact is that there are hundreds of ethnic groups suffering the same persecution in the same region. These groups are facing persecution at the hands of the Kurds. Kurdish militants have fought alongside of violent extremist groups like the Free Syrian Army, who is infamous for their famous war crimes, including the use of human shields, sexual violence, torture. Public support of the Kurds killed more civilians in Syria than ISIS. The YPG allies of the Kurds, no thank you, have been connected to dozens of suicide bombings in Shia mosques, hate crimes, and violence in Turkey and Iraq. So the questions here yet to be answered by Side Prof are, why does the West only want to establish a state for the Kurds? Why is the West so quick to look away from the Kurds' unsavory track record? The answer to both of these questions is one and the same. The West wants another Israel, the strategic public state that panders the wealthy nations by promoting Western values even at the expense of surrounding regions. The matter of fact is that this debate trade-off exists in foreign policy. Trade-offs that no one wants to make. In this case, there is a trade-off between the Kurds and the civilians in the surrounding countries of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. In the proposition's world, three things. They ignore the violence committed on behalf of the movement for Kurdish self-determination. They further strip the world's most vulnerable citizens in Syria and Iraq of natural resources, industry, and stability. They allow the West to establish a state simply because they are Western friendly, regardless of what happens in the people of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran, side opposition knows that it is unjust to reward political violence against civilians and statehood. It's wrong to take Western values and apply them to a debate regarding the Middle East. And it is wrong to allow the West to establish entire states simply because they will be Western friendly. When Kurdish, Syrian, Iraqi, Iranian, and Turkish lives are all at stake, the West shouldn't get to speak for anyone. On our second substantive argument, the creation of an independent Kurdistan weakens alliances in the region and grants more influence to belligerent actors like Russia. Our first layer of analysis regards Turkey. Turkey has been allied to the West since its reform movements following World War I, the Ottoman Empire, and Ataturk. In the past, Turkey has prioritized its EU membership, which stimulated local and social and legal reforms to make the country more open and free. This looks like close ties to Western nations like Britain, Germany, New Zealand, and even ties to the US when it comes to economic and diplomatic relationships. But recently, their Turkish president has begun shifting away from strong ties to the West due to the West's growing support of the Kurds. The US has betrayed our Turkish allies, and consequently, their president has been able to rely on Russia for support and has gathered the support of his people to become a more authoritarian leader. Turkey is less belligerent when the US can keep it close. Next, the West backing of the creation of an independent Kurdistan pushes Turkey closer to belligerent states like Russia. Here's why. When the US supports the Kurds, it is seen by Turkey as a dismissal of one of their primary concerns. Look at their president. Putin trade ordeal with Russia after Western powers supported the Syrian Kurd militia in 2017. Creation of an independent state only wrecks Western relationship with Turkey and forces Turkey to cozy up to a world power who is willing to value their interests in foreign policy. The West put Turkey in a situation where they have to choose between their own interests or the West. This is important because when the United States pushes them away by disregarding their interests, Turkey has no mechanism for accountability. And it is because the opposition firmly believes that proposing decreases sustainability and stability in the Middle East. We are so proud to propose today's motion.
Thank you. I invite the second proposition to continue debate.
In today's debate, both sides should be valuing the people and the main stakeholders of today's round, the Kurdish people. At the point that side opposition stands up here and gives you lines of analysis ignoring the Kurdish people and the genocides that they've gone through, we think that it's quite clear that side proposition has already created a route to the ballot. Side opposition has ignored the key stakeholder in today's round, so proud to continue proposing. In this speech, a few things. First, I'll be going over some clarifications that I think I have to make that came out of side opposition's first speech before asking the two questions that we think today's round are really going to fall down into, and then introducing our third substantive. So first, let's just clarify. When side opposition gives you this argument about how Kurdistan's not going to be independent, we have a few answers to this. Because Ashton gave you great lines of analysis in his first speech about how Kurdistan gains economic leverage when they're granted independence. When they finally have that ability to take advantage of those natural resources in that area, such as gas, water, oil, they're able to use that leverage and trade with other countries in order to gain stability and gain that economic leverage that will protect themselves and make sure that they're not going to become just another colony. But even further, at their highest ground, and if we take them at their highest ground and we say, okay, Kurdistan's not going to be independent, but they're not going to be fully independent, but they're going to have some ability to some sovereign ability, we think that we would rather have that than just letting the Kurdish people be genocided in the world of side opposition. And side opposition, the Kurdish people are still being hurt by Turkey. They're still being hurt by Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And side opposition does literally nothing to combat that. At the point that there's only one step to take, and side opposition hasn't presented any other avenue to help the Kurdish people, we think that it's quite clear that an independent state, even if it isn't fully independent, is the only route that we can take. But even further, we also think that maybe Kurdistan might not be independent fully independent when it first becomes sovereign, but we think that in the future it will completely become independent. Why is that? It's because of that economic leverage that we presented to you. Because when you have those resources, when Kurdistan has those natural resources such as oil, water, and gas, we think that it allows for Kurdistan to be that global player, and it allows for Kurdistan to eventually gain that independence, even if they might not gain it as soon as they become independent. But moving on to the first question of today's round, which is which side protects the global community? We regret that side opposition actually didn't provide that much analysis for the Kurdish people, instead focusing on how the global community is affected, because while we think both stakeholders are important, we think that the Kurdish people are the people we have to actually value in today's round. But I'll be getting into this question. Side opposition, in response to what we tell you, is that in response to our principle, is that the border argument doesn't make sense, that it's practical. We think that it's not enough for opposition to try to answer our principle with practical analysis, but even further, we think that there's a reason why borders and land are needed. Remember what Ashton told you in his first speech. We told you that borders uniquely have that representation for self-determination, sovereignty, and the ability for people to protect themselves. It allows a structure where a government can do things to protect themselves, and it also gives Kurdistan that ability to be represented on the global stage. The reason why is because the borders represent that sovereignty, and they represent that self-determination. At the point that we provide that land and those borders to Kurdistan, we think that they gain some form of independence, and we think that they actually gain a voice on the global stage. But even further, when they tell you about their substantive one, when they tell you about how the Kurds are already radical and we can't support them, we think that the only world where the Kurds become more radical is side opposition. Why is that? It's because Kurds are pushed to militarize when they have no other option. When side opposition tells them, okay, just stay there, just continue being attacked by these other countries, we think that the only option that the Kurds have is to militarize, because they don't have any other form to actually express what they want to say. They don't have any form to tell the global community what they're going through, because Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq have been silencing their voices for far too long. When you're pushed to militarize, we think that that only increases radicalization and only allows for that conflict in that region to escalate. That actually happens on side opposition. But even further, we think that on their substantive two, about how when they tell you about Turkey, we think that Russia has already backed down from the region. We don't think that it's a big enough link for them to say, oh, Turkey's just going to turn to Russia. But even if you don't believe that, we think that just because Turkey might turn to a different country and might be mad, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't support independence for Kurdistan, because Kurdistan has been attacked by Turkey for so long. We can't just turn our heads to what's been going on in that region, to what Turkey has been doing to the Kurds. We think that it's really ignorant and problematic for side opposition to say that we're just going to ignore that. Before I move on, I seem to hear dissent.
Let's look at both of my opponent's arguments on the Turkey point. They simply stated just now that Turkey might turn to another country, but then they state earlier on in their speech that the Kurds will be less hurt by Turkey if we allow them to create a free state. Okay. They need to establish where Turkey
I think I get your point. The thing is that inside opposition's world, when there's literally no deterrence against Turkey to attack the Kurds, that's when the Kurds are hurt. In our world, when we tell you in our model that we're going to have security guarantees, when we have those borders, when we have international representation and the US getting involved, which allows for a deterrence against military action from Turkey, we think that we actually have protection for the Kurds. Side opposition does literally nothing to help the Kurds or protect the Kurds from any ongoing conflicts or future conflicts, and rather we think that the Kurds are only pushed to militarize in their world because they have no other option from defending themselves from Turkey and those other neighboring countries. In our world, we actually have those guarantees to protect the Kurds. But moving on to our third substantive, where I'm telling you about how we reduce global conflicts. Under this, two ideas. First, I'll be talking about how we establish international standards. The biggest issue within today's debate is a mechanism in which we address the plight of the Kurds. Side proposition advocates for establishing clear standards as to how states should interact with one another and what will occur if one of those standards was violated. For example, if an independent Kurdistan was created and Turkey or Iraq were to cross the border and invade Kurdistan, this would be an action that would easily be identified as a violation of these standards that were clearly placed. This, one, acts as a disturbance for states to undermine the Kurds, and two, this acts as a form of accountability against nations that might want to invade Kurdistan. Taking side opposition at their very highest ground, and anything that they provide, any countermodel that they might want to change in their next speeches, we think that that's going to inherently be too vague. That's because in the sense that it is harder for nations to know when they have pushed too far and gone too far. Essentially, if side opposition wants to advocate for representation or any other form that they want to give to the Kurds, they are able to do things such as invading the Kurd territory the Kurds are in and ignore the international standards when it comes to Kurdistan. But under this, our second idea, which is talking about how we promote regional stability. Kurdish independence helps with wider foreign policy in the Middle Eastern region. The countries that the Kurds currently inhabit are now able to focus on their own domestic issues, as opposed to having to juggle with domestic issues and Kurdish issues. If the Kurds are granted their own nation state, they will be able to better address the problems that their people face. This would also apply to the other four nations that the Kurds currently live in, because things like Kurdish struggles for independence wouldn't be that domestic issue anymore. Even further, we think that the creation of a nation state is actually able to keep the regional communities stable. That's because the U.S. military deterrent is strong enough. When the U.S. gets involved, like we told you in our model, no one wants to face the U.S., like Turkey, Syria, Iran, or Iraq. We think that the U.S. is going to help because of the reparations we set up in our model. We allow for the region to remain stable, even when independence is granted to Kurdistan. Don't let side opposition get away with ignoring the lines of analysis we provided in our first and second speech. Don't let them get away with ignoring the Kurdish voice, so proud to stand in proposition.
Thank you for those remarks. Signed by the second opposition to continue opposition bench.
Team opposition does not believe that it's enough for team proposition to make this generalized and only focused on Kurds argument in today's debate. We have to see that this argument is also about the global community and who is impacted if we actually create an independent Kurdistan. Not only that, but in today's speech, I will also prove to you why Kurdistan will not become an independent state by itself and will also face more harms if it becomes an independent state. But moving on, I will first go over the proposition's case and their responses, or my responses to it, and then go over the op case responses. And then if I have time, I'll do a little bit of why. Okay, moving on to the prop case. They open telling us that all rights of ethnic groups have to be protected. And we agree, but we see that when the Kurds violate the rights of other ethnic groups, as well as when we see that the Kurds will be hurt when they create an independent state, we believe that they violate their own beliefs here. But moving on to their first principled argument, they talk to you about reparations, and they tell you that we need to provide reparations from the West. But again, as my partner said before, reparations must be equal in kind and quantity, and they provide no mechanism to how this would actually work or be done, meaning that it really doesn't have an impact. No, thank you. But moving on, they tell us that their first layer of analysis under the principle is borders. They say this is really a practical argument. It hinges on the fact that borders protect the Kurdish people and their sovereignty, but that's not even true if we look at international law and know that when people violate like the rights of their own people, they face much harsher punishment than when they attack another country. So we have to see that there's actually more of an incentive here to attack other countries because they face less like human rights violations and like worse punishment on an international like crime level. But moving on to the layer of analysis 2 on autonomy. Autonomy does not exist when the West controls the state. They provide they don't really give you any warrant to why they would be a state, other than this whole argument about like they gain economic leverage, but they really only have one resource, and this also, like their whole case rests on this economic leverage argument, which we will actually talk about why that's not even true in our third sub, but they tell us that they'll eventually become sovereign because of this, but no thank you. But look at Israel, the example that they provide. It's a puppet for the Western states. Like it's not independent on its own. The U.S. uses it as its own nation. Like we do not see this happening where they become their own autonomous region. And this whole principled argument really makes no sense in context when they're literally advocating for the West providing military support, economic support, whatever. No, thank you. But moving on to their third layer of analysis, which is how the U.S. abandoned Kurdistan, and we need to reverse the bad actions with these reparations. But once again, these reparations have no mechanism in the debate. They don't really explain what they would look like in the world of the proposition, and we can't really understand this argument very well. And furthermore, we don't believe that we should, no thank you, protect Kurdistan while we violate other nations' sovereignty, as well as protect a country that has already attacked other nations. But moving on to their second substantive argument. So first on this argument about political representation. They tell us that the political representation matters because the people are subject to violence, but we see that when the people leave and create their own state, they're actually going to be subject to more violence as they cause so much upset in the region. But you disagree.
We urge side opposition to actually look towards the analysis that we provided. We told you that inside opposition, they have no deterrence for Turkey to attack the Kurds. On our side, when we allow for the U.S. to actually provide, to get involved, we think that we provide deterrence for these countries to attack Turkey and to attack the Kurds and to stop attacking them now.
There's actually no deterrence though, because if the United States allies itself with the Kurds, we see that we break our alliance with Turkey, which has been established since the 1930s. No, thank you. And with the United Nations, we see that they will be pushed to Russia. This has likely already happened in 2017. They created a trade alliance. We can see that it's even happening now in their support of other nations. We see that Turkey is getting pushed to belligerent actors. They will have more support in acting upon Kurdistan and actually violating their own rights. Furthermore, taking away Turkey's own regions doesn't make them any less wanting to attack the nation. Like, if you take away like a quarter of Turkey's state, do you think that's going to make them like deterred from not like attacking Kurdistan? It makes no sense. But moving on, no thank you, to their second layer of analysis on this economic benefits argument. They tell you that they have vast oil reserves and they can have economic leverage which will gain them stability. But there's the Kurdistan, like the KRG, just Iraq alone, $17 billion in debt already, with one current source of money for the whole Kurdish region, which is just oil.
Point.
But you disagree.
The reason that that area is in debt because the Iraqi government has taken all of the money that the Kurds have been making. We think that money should be going to the Kurdish government, not to the ones that have been oppressing them.
Okay, but they still are not economically stable enough to create their own nation now. And if they only have one sort of resource to supply themselves on, it makes absolutely no sense in context that they could create a state that would diversify its economy somehow, get out of debt, and also be like very like prosperous. But moving on to our third sub on that. The economy of independent Kurdistan would be destined to fail. In order to understand this argument, we have to understand a few key points of context that seem to be implicit in today's analysis thus far. The creation of an independent Kurdistan would look like the Kurds taking huge chunks of territory from Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. These nations have been incredibly outspoken in opposition to the creation of an independent state for the Kurds, which means that they'd have very poor relations with the Kurds even after they have granted their own state. We know this for two reasons. First, the attitudes towards Kurds within these original countries would be incredibly negative, since the creation of an independent state would come at the expense of their own sovereignty. Very few people would be okay with someone taking their country's territory and claiming it as their own. Second, the Kurds in these countries have had historically bad relations, and even if you don't buy the argument that relations will come even more bitter, there's no reason to believe that they would improve for some reason. Even on proposition's highest ground here, there will still be some serious bad blood. But moving on, no thank you. With that being said, a newly born country cannot survive on its own when its neighbors are actively working to undermine their success, especially when a newborn state has an exploitable weakness. Kurdistan's Achilles heel is their would-be status as a rentier state, a state whose economy rests on a single good, in this case oil exports. The KRG pumps nearly all of this oil through the port of Ceyhan, which is in Turkey. This means that the Turkish government has huge control over what happens to Kurdish oil, and Turkey has enormous leverage over Kurdistan's economy. If Turkey shuts down this pipeline for the Kurds, they essentially choke the Kurdish economy and force Kurdistan to simply become another failed project of the West in their long list of failed states. Not only would Kurdistan be vulnerable to attacks on exports, but Kurdistan would also have dangerously heavy reliance on imports. Kurdistan imports roughly 80 to 90% of all goods. Recognize that Kurdistan would be a landlocked country surrounded by geopolitical adversaries who will be determined to undermine Kurdistan. This looks like shutting down borders and imposing tariffs and sanctions on incoming goods. These economic attacks would cause price spikes in essential goods, food shortages, restricted flow of medical supplies, and an increase in the cost of raw materials, which ripples out to disrupt national supply chains. A coordinated blockade by the government of countries like Iran and Turkey, which we have already warranted, will cause economic devastation, poverty, and the deaths of thousands, if not millions. A newborn state with an Achilles heel surrounded by an aggressive adversary and vulnerable economy creates the perfect storm for a failed state. When Kurdistan separates itself from its parent states, it loses critical protections and economic benefits that come with being part of Turkish, Iraqi, or Iranian economies. Trade-offs exist in foreign policy, and the Kurds are comparatively better without a state than they are with a failed one. And to respond to their third substantive really quickly, they make this argument that borders create accountability and it also creates regional stability. But the only benefit for regional stability is for the West and the Kurds. They ignore the other states around it and how it violates their sovereignty. As I've already said, this argument completely ignores the rest of the global community and just benefits the Kurds, who we've already proven to you are not the best people to defend. Furthermore, okay, so if you defend a country that has already killed more people than ISIS, we don't think that rewarding this country with their own land is going to do anything but create more harm in today's debate. Vote on the global community, vote on the Kurds practically, you win, or team opposition wins.
The opposition does not, and I invite the third proposition to continue debate the constitution.
For so long, the Kurdish people have been subject to the oppression and complicity of people who promised to protect them. This very same complicity is shown by side opposition at the point at which they're not even willing to acknowledge the fact that every single day, hundreds of Kurdish people are subject to the oppression of the Turkish government and the Iraqi government and the Iranian government. For these reasons, we are proud to continue proposing. In this speech, a few things. First, I'll go over some clarifications that I regret I still have to be making this late in the debate. Then I'll be breaking down the round into 2 key questions in which we can view it before going down into some weighing mechanisms. So first, on some clarifications. They want to talk to you about the global community and how it impacts all different actors. Sure, but that would have also required them to acknowledge the effects of Kurdish people when you don't actually create action in order to ensure their safety in the future. But then secondly, what makes Kurdistan a unique country, a unique ethnicity that we should be working to create a nation for? A few reasons for this that went unresponded to holistically within their side of the House, and we gave you some pretty clear lines of analysis. First, it's because Kurdistan is being invaded right now. It's because they're being subject to the daily oppression of their neighbors and the daily oppression by the people who are supposed to protect them. But then secondly, you can cross-supply our principle on this argument too, because we think ethnicities such as Kurdistan that are spread apart off of large groups of states have an obligation, have the right to the territory and a right to self-determination. But also we think that these borders will uniquely help them and prevent the invasion that we see in the status quo, and that in of itself is going to be a good thing. But then what is the comparative of the proposition plan? Because what we think is going to happen, what is happening right now with Kurdistan is only going to get exponentially worse. They talk to you about the radicalization of the Kurdish people, but fail to actually analyze that this is because it's a last resort, and the last resort becomes more of a last resort when you continue to oppress these individuals. And then what do we say as a model? First, they continue to question the proposition house by saying that we're not even sure that they'll become a sovereign state in the first place. By the wording of this motion, it's pretty fair interpretation of it to assume that a proposition gets to have the fact that the state of Kurdistan is going to be created. We don't really have to engage with that part. But then secondly, we told you that the reason why it has to be the United States is because not only does the United States have an obligation to act, it's that the United States is going to get involved either way. Because as the conflict continues to intensify, we think it's going to be against the Kurdish people now instead of in support of them. And we think that with the security guarantees that come on our side of the house, and with this protection and the mutually assured destruction that comes when the United States involves as an actor in support and in guardians of the Kurdish people, that happens on our side of the house. So now onto the first question. What is the obligation that we have to act? On our side of the house, we gave you 3 pretty clear lines of analysis. They can't respond to this with practical harms. They had to actually engage with the principle. Our principle was first saying that borders are necessarily a good thing. It's not a practical argument about how borders specifically are going to be able to help the Kurdish people, but that borders in thought are a good thing because they're able to protect against invasion and set clear lines of sovereignty in order for people to have a realm in which to protect themselves. Secondly, on this argument about sovereignty, their only response to this was saying that it's not going to be an actual state, so there's not going to be actual sovereignty. Once again, we think that we can pretty fairly assume that they will become an actual state. That's separate from their argument about how people are going to become politically dependent on the West. And even if that is going to happen, which we don't believe it is, because Kurdistan will eventually have the economic and political power to become self-dependent because of its location with oil, but even if it was not true, or even if it was true that they can become the Western puppet, we'd still prefer transfer that world to a world where people, the Kurdistani people, are being genocided and not being able to access any of the liberties or human rights that we think are inherent to the human condition. But then a third layer of analysis is we talked to you about reparations, and they said that we didn't outline what specific reparations. Our reparations argument was about how they have the obligation to repay in the form of giving the security guarantees and the security guarantees and the guardianship of the U.S. stepping in, because for so long that they haven't. We think that we can fairly assume with reasonable interpretation and with fair ground that the U.S. will be getting involved on side of the Kurdish people, and insofar as that is true, we wish that they would have responded with that. It's too late now. But now onto the second question of the round, which is where we think most of their analysis falls down into. Note, all three of their lines of analysis can be grouped into this one argument. But the thing that they have taught you most in this debate is that they told you that there's no method or there's no power of deterrence, and so instability is going to be continuing to ensue. But the biggest problem with this line of analysis is, once again, it ignores our entire advocacy and what we've been talking to you. We told you this whole idea of mutually assured destruction, when you set a red line and draw a line in the sand as to where a country is and who's protecting that said country. We don't think Turkey is going to want to invade a sovereign state that is protected by the United States, because Turkey knows it would face retaliation from the United States. That's why we see this type of balance of power. That's where we see the deterrence come into play. We think this is comparatively different from the gray zones that we see right now, where Turkey is able to continuously encroach on the ability and the land of the Kurdish people, because there is no set definitive from America or from the West. Then, what we told you on our side of the house is that we think it's very bad now, but it's only going to get exponentially worse. Now, why is this the case? We gave you a few clear lines of analysis. First, we told you that the Kurdish people are continuously attacked until they will be eradicated. This is the case because we already see these attacks and the massacres of Kurdish people that range up into the hundreds of thousands of lives that are going to be lost. We think that is enough of a reason to assume that it's going to get even worse, because this violence doesn't seem ever yielding. But then secondly, we told you that even farther than that, the reason why so many Kurdish people are resorting to violence or getting involved in wars right now is because they have no other option. We don't think we think that the reason why they become so radicalized is a method by which a self-defense to protect themselves from the people who've been constantly wishing upon their destruction. This likely radicalization only gets worse and worse, and we see that the instability in that region only continuously expand. Before I move on, I will take a point if there is one.
Okay, do borders end genocide?
I don't think that this is a fair understanding of what we've been talking about, because we think that borders are able to extremely help in the ability to deter the fact that the genocide is happening right now, because there's this mutually assured destruction that I talked to you and gave you a minute of analysis on. When there's this deterrence that is happening, we think that there's not going to be a genocide that continues to exist, because no one's going to continuously oppress a group that is being protected by the United States. And now onto their side of the house as it pertains to this argument. They talked to you about a principle which, unlike our principle, is not actually a principle, it's just a practical. They talked to you about instability continuing to ensue because the Kurdish people are going to be radicalized. I responded to this with our comparable lines of analysis about how the radicalization of the Kurdish people only gets so much worse. And then they talked to you about Western dependency. Once again, we responded to this by talking to you about, responded to this third substantive argument by talking to you about how Western dependency, even if it's going to be happening, is comparatively better than the eradication of the Kurdish people in general. Whatever happens in the opposition bloc, they are too far behind. They have not responded to our arguments about this mutually assured destruction that we've talked to you about again since the beginning, how that's a promise of deterrence. We win on the reversibility of ethnic cleansing and the cyclicality of these impacts that continue to perpetuate through society unless we take a stance right now.
Thank you as much. I invite the third opposition to continue debate with the opposition bench.
Side proposition tells you that justice has to be served for the Kurds because the Kurds have been oppressed in the past. And while we sympathize with the struggle of the Kurds, We also recognize that trade-offs exist in foreign policy, a fact that side proposition has refused to engage with. We also understand that the people of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey aren't exactly living lavishly in these countries right now, and they also have to be considered in this debate as critical stakeholders. And we also recognize that the Kurds are not perfect when it comes to the defense of their military. They've worked with extremist armies like the Free Syrian Army, which has caused more instability, more deaths, more civilian casualties. We also recognize that the West shouldn't speak for the Kurds, for the Iranian lives, the Turkish lives, and also the Syrian lives that are at risk, even if Kurdistan is their mouthpiece. To simplify today's debate, we have three critical questions. The first question is who upholds the principal conduct and foreign policy for the West? The principal debate has really come down to a debate about what is right and wrong for the West to do when it comes to Kurdistan. Let's begin on their ground. Side proposition has told you over and over again that the West has an obligation to provide reparations. This takes the form of two different things. First is borders, and second is support. So, when they talk about borders, they say that we have an obligation to principally provide borders to the Kurds because borders work, because borders protect culture, meaning that we only have an obligation to provide the Kurds borders if side proposition can show that borders indeed protect their culture and protect their defense. The second issue that they bring up is support. And they tell you that we have an obligation to support them because we withdrew our support from the past. The problem with this is that even if you take them on their highest ground and assume that we do have this principal obligation, we assume that this is not a practical argument, you cannot simply just divorce the consequences of actions from actions from consequences, because if you should not give the Kurds their own state if it comes at the expense of millions of lives in different countries. So let's begin on where the opposition is winning today's debate on the principle. We are the only team that deals with the morality of establishing states in non-Western regions. We have two key points of ground on the principle. First, it's because we tell you it is principally wrong for the West to establish states based on how friendly they are going to be to the West. When the United States comes into different regions that they don't necessarily understand and basically picks and chooses who gets their own state, it is prioritizing certain ethnic groups and certain kinds of people over others based on no real warrants. There's no intrinsic difference between the human dignity of the Kurdish people and the human dignity of the Iraqi people and the Syrian people who would also suffer. There's no reason why you value their interests over the interests of those groups that we've defended throughout this debate. And the second is because this would be an act in favor of U.S. paternalism, where the United States steps in to act in the interests of others, despite the fact that it's really disguising it as self-interest. The only reason the U.S. has supported the Kurds in the past, and the only actual real-world reason why the U.S. and the West would support the Kurds in the future in establishing their own state, is because it comes at an intrinsic and direct interest for the United States. It is principally wrong for the United States to act on their own interests at the expense of millions of other people. So let's move on to the second question in today's debate, which is who can best protect regional stability. So I'm frankly surprised that side proposition decided to use this analogy between the Kurds and the other states that they're taking from, and Israel and the states that we took from when we established Israel as a state. And then they're going to make the argument that the only stakeholders that should matter in this debate are the Kurds. If we take these two analogies and combine them together, it's basically them saying that when we established Israel, the only stakeholders that we should consider is Israel. We believe that the people whose land we are taking from are also critical stakeholders in this debate, something that they have refused to engage on. They have refused to actually provide any warrants on why they promote regional stability, on why they can actually defend the people whose rights, whose sovereignty, and whose interests are being sacrificed in other countries that we are taking from. Only side opposition has provided any analysis on regional stability, which is why you win, which is why we win on the practical. Let's talk about the intrinsic points that we have on the ground here. So our ground comes in two different ways. First is we talk about how we increase conflict, because we believe that when we take land from areas like Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, they're not simply going to stop attacking the Kurds, right? They're going to increase their severity of attacks. They're going to increase the seriousness of their attacks, because this is seen by these countries as a Western attack on them. When we take their land, when we annex their land and provide a Western-friendly state in their regions, The Turkish governments, the Syrian governments, and Iraqi and Iranian governments are not going to simply accept this, move on, do business with the Kurds, and not attack them. There's absolutely no warrants on why Kurdistan is going to be an intrinsically safer region after we establish them as our own state, except for this argument where they bring you when they say it's still better for the Kurds if they can have their own state because they also can defend themselves. The problem with this argumentation is it still ignores the non-Kurds who would be sacrificed by regional stability. So if the Kurds can still defend themselves, that's going to mean that the Kurds retaliate. That's going to mean more violence, more death, which is not something that side proposition should be defending in this debate. The second reason is because we have shown you that the United States breaks critical alliances with Turkey, which there's been very little reliance on, except for the fact that they say that Turkey should not be prioritized in this debate. So this is not real analysis because you can't simply just say that Turkey shouldn't be considered in this debate when they're literally one of the most intrinsic stakeholders and obvious pieces of ground for opposition in this debate. Simply saying that they should not be considered is not real analysis. It's not real argumentation. We have told you that when the United States disregards the interests of Turkey and because we are allied, it means that Turkey's going to have to look towards other countries in the region who are going to support them. We give you warrants on why this is going to be Russia and why that's worse. Because Turkey has no accountability when Russia, who is also guilty of severe human rights abuses in the Middle East and in their own country, because when Russia increases their dominance in the region, it makes it unsafe for the Turkish citizens who are going to live under the authoritarian regimes, but also for the regions who's going to be destabilized by Russian interference. The third critical question is who can best protect the Kurdish interests in this debate. Before I move on, I will take a point.
We think at the point at which side opposition is unwilling to actually talk about the Kurdish people in their speech at all, we think it's fairly problematic. They haven't been willing to acknowledge that actors like Turkey are the ones who have been oppressing the Kurdish people for decades.
Right, so the third question is who can best protect the Kurds? This is where our ground comes from on this point, and also what I find pretty surprising is that they didn't respond to our third substantive, which is a critical piece of ground for who can best protect the Kurds. This brings us into our two main points of clash on this debate. First is who can best protect economic security of the Kurds, and second is the physical security. Let's begin on the economic security, because this is what the proposition brought up in their first speech, and it's how we respond with our third sub, which didn't go responded to. So, on the economic security, we brought you two main arguments. First is because most of the Kurdish economy rests on imports. We told you that 80 to 90% of the Kurdish Kurdish goods come from imports. And we also told you that basically the Kurds are going to be surrounded by geopolitical adversaries. It is a landlocked country. They cannot expect to receive these imports that they would now because trade-offs exist in foreign policy. Although they might not have their own states, they're still going to be able to import these countries in these goods in opposition's world. They're still going to have this kind of benefit of being part of Turkish, Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian governments, something that side proposition cannot defend. Also on the second argument is the exports argument. The main way that Kurdistan supports their economy is through exports. They do this through primarily Turkey. We do not believe that Turkey is going to continue to allow Kurdistan to export severe amounts of oil that strengthens their state when it comes at a disadvantage to the interests of Turkey. Turkey and Iran and Syria and Iraq are simply going to provide more sanctions, which is going to worsen the poverty in Kurdistan, and it's going to make Kurdistan intrinsically become a failed state. We believe we believe in side opposition, that trade-offs exist, which is why Kurdistan is better without a state than they are with a failed one. So proud to oppose.
You invite the opposition to apply to close that opposition.
The proposition claims to protect the Kurds, but they prove to not do that in today's speech. I will explain why, and I will tell you why in a comparative world, the op world is so much better for the Kurds, for the international community, and for regional stability than the prop world could ever claim to be. Okay, first, I would like to start in the op world. So let's go on to principle first, which is what we are winning on in today's debate. They have completely ignored that the argument that an independent Kurdistan is rooted in American supremacy. This has gone unresponded to down the bench, and they base their whole argument off of like U.S. involvement in Kurdistan. The U.S. should not involve itself in complex geopolitics it has no place in. Again, look at this example of Israel. We are only caring about the nation that we establish and not the impacts of what happens later. We are using it as a geopolitical puppet for our own self-interested gain to push our own morals, which really have no place. We do not need to have our own spot in this argument. The principle is what we are winning on today because they have completely ignored it. It's not based in the practical at all like they argue. We can tell you that the creation of an independent Kurdistan will actually, it's rooted in U.S. supremacy. But we have to see that, like in a principled world on the opposition side, we are the only ones who actually care about what happens in the region and what the after effects will be. But moving on to the practical. So let's talk about Turkey first. This whole Turkey argument basically goes unresponded to as well. They give you no real analysis other than this double bind where they say that Turkey like will help create the nation at first, but then they also say that like Turkey will actually go against the nation. And let's go to what's actually going to be true in today's debate, that Turkey will be so upset by the land being taken from them that they will not let trade go through, they will not let the country thrive, they will be pushed to other belligerent actors. We see that this has a host of impacts that have gone unresponded to once again in today's debate. We see that when Turkey works with Russia, works with other belligerent actors, and actively works to make sure that Kurdistan fails, we are actually violating the rights of the Kurds and the rights of those in the Middle East, which is a big impact in today's debate. But furthermore, the economic benefits that are provided under the op world. The economies. While the Kurds remain in the nations that they inhabit, they have legitimate economic institutions, trade, the ability to import and export, etc. But when they establish their state, they lose all sorts of economic benefits whatsoever and have nothing left. A failed state is not actually going to protect the Kurdish people, and they have not responded to our whole argument about how this will like intrinsically fail because of their economic reliance as well as their like economic like lack of diversity. But moving on to the pop world. So on their principle, all of their principled arguments rest on the practical arguments that have failed. We've carried this down the bench for you. We tell you that on borders, borders can't prevent genocide. Like they make this wild claim that say that like borders are good because the borders will protect the people, but that again hinges on the fact that they'll actually protect the people. We can see throughout the history of the world that borders don't end genocide. They don't actually work to protect people. We can even look at international laws that make it easier for you to attack a country if you aren't actually like, to attack people if they're not underneath your own country. It's easier to attack another nation than it is to your own people. But furthermore, on the reparations argument, we tell you down the bench that reparations must be equal in kind and quantity. They have absolutely no mechanism for it. You cannot vote on it in today's debate. And then on autonomy, they tell you that like they will somehow be autonomous, but we have carried it down the bench that they will not be if they are a geopolitical puppet of the West. But on the practical, we can see violence worsens when international law makes it easier for them to attack and states fail. Economic benefits, there's absolutely no analysis on their side about how the economy will actually thrive. We tell you it'll fail. That's the biggest impact in today's debate. They cannot protect those they claim to. We know that the state will fail. There's no reason to create it if we know it will just harm the Kurds more and harm the whole region and destabilize it. As far as regional stability, there's no warrants throughout the debate and it makes absolutely no sense. If you take land from a region, it will be mad. In a comparative analysis, we see that the only side that actually protects regional stability, the Kurds and the international community, is the op world. The prop fails to do it. Vote op.
Thank you. I read the proposition of hypothesis of the entire debate.
This debate was supposed to be about which mechanism would best solve the Kurdish suffering and would best serve the Kurds. At the point that side opposition claims that they're going to be helping the Kurds and then leave them to suffer without any changes in their world, we think that it's quite clear that side proposition has already won today's debate. In this speech, a few things. First, I'll be going over some key clarifications that I regret I have to make this late in today's round before moving on to the two key questions that we think today's round has really boiled down into. So first, just to clarify, we'd like to go back to the thing that Caroline told you in her third speech. Can the Kurdish people support themselves? When Caroline told you in her third speech was that yes, they can, but I'll still extend this into my fourth because side opposition's opposition block was really focusing on this. When the Kurdish people export $26.5 billion every single year, we think that it's quite obvious that they don't need Turkey to survive and that they're able to actually have that power on a global stage. That's not something that side opposition has responded to. They simply just repeated their arguments without acknowledging the analysis that Caroline provided in her third. But even further, we think that yes, it is frowned upon to oppress people, but it is far more frowned upon in our world when we have those international standards from international groups. When we see these international standards being set, those red lines being set, we think that we actually see people who are trying to invade Kurdistan being held accountable, unlike what happens inside opposition. But even further, on the third clarification I have to make, which is that, again, our example of Israel is not our model. Rather, we would say that it's not our practical goal, but it is the principal reason. We don't think that side opposition has actually engaged with our example of Israel reasonably when we tell you that, again, it's not our model, it's not what we're basing our case upon. We're just saying that there's still the same principle reason behind that independence of Israel. But even further, they don't provide any analysis or any response to our analysis about MAD, the mutually assured destruction point that both Caroline and I brought up in our speeches. The same line of analysis that they gave, it's the same line of analysis which proves why actors like Russia and Turkey won't mess with Kurdistan. It's because if they do, they know that they're going to be hurt by the US because the US in our model has that obligation to help out because they have hurt and betrayed Kurdistan so much in the past. We think that side opposition hasn't actually properly engaged with our model and the analysis that we provide when they just ignore and pick and choose what they want to respond to. But moving on to our to the two key questions of today's round, which is who wins on the principle. When we tell you in our very first speech, we've told you about Kurdistan, how it's both principally and practically justified. Instead of attacking our principle, they simply said borders are not our principle, not practical. Okay, we've already answered this down the bench. Borders principally are good because they, one, have the nature of sovereignty, which rests in the right to occupy and obtain land in borders, and two, land is the basis of a government. They had no response. But even further, and we think this was a critical mistake of side opposition, they didn't respond to the rest of our principle when we told you about how when an ethnic group has distinct culture, is persecuted, and is split up along different nations, they deserve to have their own nation state. They had no response. But even further on the second question of today's debate, which is which side wins on the practical, we think that we have to look at two lenses to really address who wins. First, the Kurds. Side opposition leaves the Kurds to just suffer with the attacks that are going on right now. On side proposition, we uniquely have that deterrence because one, the US is going to get involved and no one wants to mess with the US. But second of all, we have those newly established international standards that side opposition fails to even recognize and engage with. When you have those international standards, people know what is wrong and know that they aren't going to be able to invade the Kurds anymore. We think that that's something that they forgot. But even further, opposition doesn't do anything to stop the attacks. That's something that they had a critical mistake. They don't do anything to solve. But even further, we also solve the global problem because we are allowing for the region to stay stable. We're allowing for the region to stay stable because of MAD. We think that side proposition has clearly made the route to the ballot. So proud to continue proposing.
Thank you to both teams.
Good round.
Good round.
Great round.
Good round.